welcome to the GIC College of Central Bankers Conversation Series. I'm Kathleen Stephenson, the Vice Chair of the College, and today we will explore the themes of the labor market, what does it mean, and in terms of overall growth here in the US, of labor unions, and what appears to be their renewed rise in America. We are joined by Danny Blanchflower, who is a fellow of the college, but he is also, and perhaps more importantly, a tenured professor in economics at Dartmouth College, a research associate at the NBER, and a professor at the University of Glasgow. And way back to between 2006 and 2009, importantly, he was a member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. And in 2009, he was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire. Danny, welcome.
Oh, hi, Truth.
Exactly. So, let's maybe start with what your view is today in terms of the economy. We had this 4.9 Q3 GDP growth. Does it fit with the rest of the metrics? And particularly when you look at the labor market, sure, the labor market is strong, but we do see some timid cracks. So, what is your take on all this?
Wow, what a great question. There's so much to it. I think we should, I would like to, I'm a European. I come from the UK. I think you should start off, we've seen data this week, that basically says that the Eurozone, most of Europe, probably China, but certainly Germany, France, Italy, the UK, are all in recession. And what we saw in 2007-8 was the winds started in America in a global way, and they spread across the Atlantic. So the question really here, I think, is the US immune from those winds? Are those winds just not going to blow back again? And the US can continue on its way. The obvious growth number was pretty amazingly high, but there is some evidence that I take a lot of concern with. So over the years, I've tried to model. When I was on the Bank of England in April 2008, I looked at data and I said, it looked to me that the US was in recession in December 2007, and the rest of the world was in recession around then. It turns out that was right. And so this is evidence from consumer confidence. And if you take consumer confidence evidence in the United States, if you look at the Conference Board or you look at the University of Michigan, they've all been saying for the last 10 months or so that the US is in recession. They were pointing to recession at the start of 2022. The NBER, who calls recession, didn't call that, but we had 2 negative quarters there. So there was some weakening there. So you have this period where consumer confidence is low, but people, despite the fact that they say things are bad, have continued to spend, hence the relatively high GDP growth. And then you have this other phenomenon, which is obviously rising inflation. And the other thing we've started to see somewhat are rises in wage settlements. I'm just looking at the Bloomberg measure, approximately 7%. So we're seeing attempts by unions in a relatively tight labor market to sort of hold steady. The UAW has made a big move. But the question really is, where are we really? Where are we going? And I think the sense is that despite the data feeling that there's a tight labor market, people don't feel that good. That's the starting point from the consumer confidence. And yes, it's true, and we can give more details about it. Yes, it's true the unemployment rate is low, but I have a series of papers where I say that's the wrong measure. For our listeners, I started out, I came to Dartmouth in 1989 working on the relationship between wages and unemployment. And that pattern in the data,
wage curve.
The wage curve, exactly. The pattern of wages, basically, you could think wages are set, they're set by an intricate blend of insider and outsider forces. Unions are part of the insider forces, and the unemployment rates start part of the outside forces. But no longer since 2008, so all the wage curve stuff stops working in 2008. No longer does the unemployment rate impact wages. Well, what impacts it? Well, turns out broader measures of the labor market. The underemployment rate's a big deal, but the other thing, which is a really big deal, which sets the US apart from other places, is the non-participation rate, the employment rate. And the employment rate today in the United States is well below what it was in 2000. The only country basically in the world that that's true of. So Greece and Spain, and all these other countries. So basically what we find is that that measure, if you like, the outside of the labor market, outside the job market, that's what's pushing down on wages. So that in a sense, the mistake people make is they focus on the unemployment rate to say how great everything is. But they don't realize that there's lots of people out there who are not in employment and not in unemployment who would like to get jobs, and they're keeping wages down. So that sort of explains the story. I mean, I've just finished with one sentence. So there's much more slack in the labor market than many listeners to this program believed, or that the Fed believed in 2015 to 18. And I'll just stop with one thing. So I think the biggest macro problem we have to explain is why was wage growth so benign between 2010 and 2020? And the answer is there was much more slack in the labor market than others thought. That's the story. So there's more slack out there. That's why people feel relatively bad. And my concern, we'll get to it in a minute, my concern is the labor market is slowing.
Well, you say, why do you say from 2010? I mean, you can go back much further and realize that, the real wages haven't really done much.
No, agreed. Agreed. I mean, the real wage today, if you take production and non-supervisory workers, and I like to look at their weekly wages. So production and non-supervisory private sector work, that's about 80% of the private sector workforce. Their real wage today is still below what it was of their grandparents in 1975, right? So that's obviously a really big deal. And then obviously what happened in the last 2 or 3 years with the rise in inflation, real wages fell back again. People were getting 3% wage rises, and when inflation was 7%, that meant real wages have fallen. So yes, you're right. The real wages have not grown well. And the other thing, of course, is that it's not just those 80%. They are 80% of the private sector workforce, but the other 20%, the one on the right-hand side, have done really well. So the comparison between, let's say, the people in the top 5 percentile of the distribution and everybody else has worsened. So in a sense, what you learn in much of behavioral economics is that relative things matter. And now, when the labor market has certainly tightened somewhat, now workers feel that they can make up for lost time. So I was listening to UAW talking about, we gave concessions prior to 2008. We gave them to Chrysler when they were doing badly. And now it's our turn to get things back. And that turnaround has happened.
Yeah. So before we dive into more into the union, the role of the union in the collective bargaining, there's a body of research that says, that looking back, one of the reasons why we haven't seen any major increases in wages is because of the concentration of very few employers, let's say, large employers in specific areas, right?
Right. Well, I certainly monopsony power, but I'd like to set things up this way. Go back to what I said. So wages are set by the ability of firms to pay and the availability of workers out there in the labor market. So for young people, the wage of graduating seniors from Dartmouth and other places, their lifetime earnings are a function of the unemployment rate on the day that they leave, right? So that's obviously a big part of the story. But I think perhaps we should explore this. So over the last decade or so, firms had the ability to pay workers more. They did. Profits were good. These large organizations, they had the ability to pay workers, and they chose not to. So they chose to pay it to the shareholders, and they chose to pay it to the CEOs. And what was interesting, if I go back to the Bank of England, so when times are tough, the governor of the Bank of England comes out and says, well, inflation's rising. Now it's time for the workers to give up some of their wage gains. But the story is, well, I wonder why he didn't say those who gained really well in the past, the shareholders and the CEOs, why didn't he say to them, now it's your chance to just swallow that price increase because you've done so well and not raise prices and not hurt the workers? But he didn't say that. He didn't say, CEOs, profit, this is now your turn, you've done so well. It's like, go for the workers. So that did not go down well. Did not go down well in Britain. Did not go down well that somebody who was making a very large pay, and they said to him, are you taking a pay cut? And he said, no. This is the sort of class warfare. But now what's happened is what you lose on the roundabouts, you may well gain on the swings. And what you've now seen is a sort of resurgence in worker bargaining power. Because remember what I said, firms had the ability to pay workers more, and they chose not to.
Right.
And if you take the sort of typical pay of a worker in a firm and compare it to that of the CEO's pay goes up in multiples of 100, and the worker's pay in real terms remains flat. So what you've got here is, there's tension in the air, and this is where our conversation is going. The likelihood is that workers are going to say enough. A union, and with UAW, has just done pretty darn well. Maybe it's, and if Dartmouth, one of the big stories at Dartmouth is an attempt actually to unionize our basketball team. We can get to that. And they filed an NLRA filing to unionize Dartmouth's basketball team.
And only the basketball team.
Only the basketball team, apparently, for now. Okay. I don't know, but we'll see. This is to do with the sets of legislation that were done in the court hearings in the past. And it couldn't be for a public university, so they found Dartmouth, which is a private university. But the very fact that kids on our basketball team are trying to unionize is pretty interesting. It's
interesting, yeah. But
whether they will or not is another thing.
Yeah, but to come back to what you're saying, I mean, so wages, the pie essentially has not been distributed evenly relative to the productivity growth that the worker is performing, Correct. Right? But Correct. Some of the bargaining over the past, whenever we say, oh, it's a jobless recovery, whenever that comes into the public discourse, that there is a focus on benefits as opposed to wages, right? And that seems to have essentially been sidelined. And now we're talking wages, courtesy the inflation rate.
Well, so this is something interesting. I was thinking about talking to you about this as I was coming on. I've been involved over time in negotiating union 3-year contracts. Turns out, those are really, really hard things to negotiate because of one really big thing. So think of the components of a wage contract: wages, pension, and benefits, health benefits. The problem in negotiating these 3-year contracts is that employers can't buy a 3-year health benefit, right? So, there's a story which is, okay, we'll give you 5,000 a year, and next year we'll give you 6, and next year we'll give you 7. But the problem is the unions say, well, we just want you to keep us whole and buy the health benefits. So actually, that's just made it harder and harder and harder for anybody to negotiate a 3-year contract, for any union to do that. But obviously, part of the story here, and you've made it sensibly, part of the story here is it's easier to negotiate wage growth because you know what it is. You say, you could say something like, here's the wages are going to rise by 30% over the 3-year period of the contract. They're going to go up by this, this, and this. And that's that. Now, they could put COLA clauses in there, but basically you can negotiate a wage, and that's essentially easier. And I think that's where they're going to go. But the problem, as you see, is that you can't go to a health insurance company and buy insurance for 3 years because of the cost, the things that are going on. But so sensibly, unions are starting to think about wages, and you're seeing sensible, larger increase in wages. And listening to the automotive companies, they're talking about, yes, this will have an increase in the cost of a car, but we're looking for productivity increases. And I think what you're going to see is the unions are going to be very strong in trying to help that. There are gains from trade, right? Well, you'll give us more money. You say we've got to raise productivity. Okay, then we'll try and help you to do that if we get part of the spoils. And that's not what's happened.
Well, but, it's intriguing what you just said, that, there is the focus on wages. Fine. Why today? I mean, when you look at what has happened, that there's been, the unions, they've been, weakened dramatically. We're talking 81, with the Reagan. We're talking the Tea Party with, the state pensions were,
Reagan was it in 82, where Reagan basically went after the air traffic controllers.
Exactly. Yeah. So then the question is, why today focusing on wages when in fact you can argue that that should have been the focus all along, except that you have the weakening of the labor at the table of the collective bargaining.
Well, I certainly think there's been a weakening at the bargaining table, not least because of globalization. I mean, in a sense, go back to what you just said, we certainly see around the world the same processes are in play, perhaps not to the same level, but we see similar patterns. So an example, in the UK, higher union membership in the public sector, declining membership in the private sector. But I think the answer in some sense is, well, what is it? I mean, in a way, why the US is in a sense different is that unionization is done in such an adversarial way. Right. Which it isn't in other countries, in Germany and France and the UK and elsewhere. It's not done by elections. You don't get to hire union-busting firms to come and argue that this is not the election that you should have. And that strike. I mean, the other thing around the world, of course, is that strikes have been a thing of the past. But what did we see here? We shouldn't forget that the wage increase that came for many of these workers came after a period of strike. Mm-hmm. And in a sense so strikes occur at the end of the union contract. And perhaps what's happened, I suspect what happens, is that the employers accepted the strike, said, okay, nobody much will show up, they'll just fold. And perhaps what happened is they didn't fold. The workers didn't fold. Why? I mean, presumably the firms lost. They lost money by lost production, and they still ended up settling. So the normal answer is, well, they probably underestimated the strength of the unions. And obviously the other story might well be, so what about all the other car companies? What about Volkswagen and Toyota? And I assume that the unions have their eyes now. Now they've got their eyes on the other guys. And so that process is coming. I mean, obviously part of the story going back, if you're Trump and you start to talk about protection and you start to talk about removal of competition, well, I mean, so Trump goes to the UAW and talks about supporting. Well, if you're a protectionist, unions going to benefit from it, because unions are going to be there when there's a monopoly, and so there are rents to share. So managers like a monopoly, work for unions like a monopoly. The problem is that you and I end up paying a higher price for the car. So there's this trade-off.
And I guess that this is exactly what happened, is that with the shift. Not just with Biden, but it started, of course, with Trump. The tariffs, the kind of a very much America First type. That is a very good environment or positive environment for unions to step in.
Right. Well, let me broaden that a little bit. Think about the European Union. So the European Union essentially has a barrier around it. And the Germans say we have sets of standards. We have standards in Germany, and we want to impose those standards for things coming into the country, because the danger is that, sorry, I should have turned my phone. The danger is that countries are able to come into Europe, and they're able to undersell by not maintaining the same standards. So in some senses, Europe has this trade barrier which does the same thing. It's essentially a protection for particular industries, which gives an incentive for firms to be able to unionize and for workers to be able to unionize.
Well, yes, but in that respect, I mean, the tradition of unions, and there again, there's such a difference between Northern Europe and the southern part, right? I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it's much more confrontational in the southern part, whereas in northern you have it.
Well, right. So think there's a couple of other things. It's more confrontational. In some sense, the story of unions in the United States and Italy is actually also to do with crime and corruption. There's two countries where unions have been, Hoffer and all that sort of stuff. Not true so much in other places, but certainly in Europe, not just in Europe. Think about it in a place like France, where not so many people are members of unions, but you don't have to be a member of a union for the union to bargain for you. Right?
Exactly.
So what we have to remember is, in lots of countries, in France, membership may be 10%, but coverage is nearly 100%. And then what you have, there's a set of stories. I remember being in Sweden, and stories there are, so bargaining is done centrally. Well, why is there's a central bargain for the unions, and the labor organization, the LO, goes and talks to the employers, but they both understand the macro circumstances. So the argument is that if you have unions in Europe, they may be centralized. Bargaining occurs centrally, and people they're the same people continue to bargain. The thing with wages, in a sense, go back to what we were saying. It's not like if you go to a restaurant and they serve you horrid food and you leave. This is a repeat bargain. You're coming back again, and you're coming back again, and you're coming back again. And in some sense, I think, go back to what we were saying a minute ago, in some sense, I think what we're going to see is payback. As I say, I've listened to the union negotiators, and they sort of said, they did us before, and now it's our turn. The pendulum has shifted a little, whether that's true or not. But people obviously listening to this is, we have not seen strikes. We haven't seen firms basically folding. I mean, the automakers folded.
So you mentioned that, and let's go back a couple of decades. That in your PhD dissertation, it was about union and wages, if I'm correct. Were you broad conclusions and? Yeah. Are we seeing similarities now, later?
Well, I think, let me say a couple of things. So yes, in the early 1980s, I wrote a thesis on...
I didn't want to say the
80s, I know, it was a bit... Anyway, I wrote a thesis on how do unions impact the world? What do they do? And what's the size of the union wage differential? Which is, take someone with all their characteristics in a union setting, and then you just change the union setting to a non-union setting, or vice versa, and you see what happened. But a big part of that was actually my PhD was linked to the UK Department of Employment. And what was interesting is that the UK decided it needed to do what I call the economics of walking about. And they were very early days, decided instead of interviewing people, they would interview firms. So essentially establishments, but they went in to start to think about, what establishments, what they did, what industrial relations looked like. And in a sense, just to think of, imagine a firm. A firm's got two branches. It's got a farm, and it's got, it manufactures tires. Well, if you say, well, what's the unionization rate of the firm? Well, the answer is it's 100% in that firm and 0% in that firm. So a lot of what we're seeing is importantly to think about establishments and firms. And essentially what we learned from it is that internal things matter. The ability to bargain matters, but it doesn't have to be a firm, because it could be a doctor's, it could be the bar or some such thing. But also relevant to this is that there's all kinds of things that unions do. So unions, I remember my old professor said to me, what you got to remember, Danny, is that unions in a workplace can decide everything. They decide everything. Now, it may be that the unionization comes when the workplace is aging, but basically they decide, the gender mix. They decide who's got what the rules are, what the retirement rules are, how the pay increases come. So I learned a lot about that. But I also learned that the world changed. And as a sense, I came to America, and the story I learned there was nobody cares about unions because there aren't any. And now, right? So those were important things to learn. But I also think, so a good example, let me give you an example. I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about what's happened within firms. So underemployment has risen a lot. And that's within a firm, there are normally employed people, and the firm brings in people who work in 20 hours a week for a lower wage, and they'd like to work more. And that sets people off against each other. What's keeping the wages down of the people within the same firm are the wages of people that they know, right? So they're in the same firm, they know them, and that's a transformation. That's a sort of transformation of bargaining. But the other story is that union workplaces, unions generally don't allow underemployment. That's just not unions can negotiate that away. So this is, and then the last thing, in principle, in principle, we really, I mean, this is famously by a Dartmouth alum, the most famous labor economist, I guess, who worked on unions, Richard Freeman. And Richard Freeman talked about the potential for unions to impact productivity. And his story was always, as everyone sort of think of it, there's no obvious reason that we could work out what the sign is. You know, do unions raise productivity? Do they worsen productivity? And the answer is there's no reason it should be one or the other. It's a matter of fact and a matter of the data. And I think the answer is, back to your really good questions, I think you're going to see a resurgence of unions if they start to realize that they were doing with the auto workers. Well, you give us a pay raise and we'll help raise productivity, and then you'll get money and we'll get a share of it. In principle, unions could be positive for productivity, and they haven't been. They haven't.
Well, that would be if, you know, you are in a non-confrontational,
yes,
setting.
No, right. If you start to lessen the non-confrontational setting, and then you might think of something we were just talking before we started, and then the other thing they might well be doing is go back to where they were as friendly societies. They were actually about, the union was in the mining town, and if the miner got pneumoconiosis, they sent them to a place to look after them. If someone died in the pit, the union would come along. So in principle, you could see that unions might have a role now. Think they could negotiate insurance. They could negotiate car insurance. They could do all kinds of stuff and use their power to help people and make it attractive for them to come and
but which I think they're doing at the moment, right? I mean, that's
yes, but you could think the role. I mean, you could think you're in a union. There's a million of us, right? Well, I can sell you discounted holidays. I can buy you discounted car insurance. I can buy you, discounted food every year. But if you think of that, if you're,
in other words, a cost
non-confrontation, well, maybe, but non-confrontational, which is your point.
Right.
And what's happened in the US is that this has been confrontational. I mean, it's obviously had the same effect in countries around the world. But the other thing we need to talk a little bit about is that the story is somewhat different in the public sector.
Yes.
The public sector has been a big deal. And it's been a big deal around the world. In the UK, the public sector is a really big deal. So think that some of the sectors around the world which were privatized supposedly to be more efficient and lower priced. Well, in the UK, water is a good example. So you privatize water, and the prices rose, and the service deteriorated. And you did the same with railways. So essentially, I think there's a huge pressure on the public to say, well, let's renationalize these things. And then, of course, there's an incentive for the workers to become unionized and so on. But so the process of denationalizing, privatizing things, I think is going to have a, the point of the successful ones were the ones in the UK, certainly, that were privatized to competition. So British Airways has to compete with, every airway in the world. But the water company, the taps turned off in Britain where it rains all the time. So people are not happy. They're not happy about the trains. They're not happy about the infrastructure. And we're going to see, I think, a resurgence of things in the public sector. And I mean, think in America, the strength of the police and the teachers. These are all, and I've worked a lot on those.
Absolutely.
issues.
But, it's interesting because I think that going forward, one of the major structural change that unions will have to tackle with is AI, the role of AI.
Absolutely.
The labor force. And what does that mean? What would be the role that the unions would have to play?
Well, no, I agree with that. And in a sense, you to be a Luddite is all very well, but in a sense, if the union could be positive to productivity, the unions could help a lot with, the union the guy on the production line knows here's a better way of doing things. And I think what you'll see will be if the unions start to be flexible and start to say, we'll think of ways where we can adapt this, as long as we get to share some of the spoils. So what happened is that, so think of a strike. Everyone says, oh, isn't it terrible? The workers went out and strike. It's the workers' fault. And I always say, well, how do you know it was the workers' fault? Maybe it was just terrible management. There's two sides to this. Maybe the managers are the ones who were hopeless. You don't know. You don't know that that's true.
But that, what this presupposes is a complete change in the mindset again, that, this is not confrontational. This is, you can argue an external event, AI,
I think so.
that we need to tackle together.
Well, I think so. Think about an external event, AI, which follows a major shock to all kinds of things, which was the pandemic. So this has had a major shock on all kinds of relations. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, I'm doing all sorts of work, and others are, on what's the effect of not just artificial intelligence, but also, the internet and cell phones. And we see this huge rise in cyberbullying, which has had a terrible effect on the well-being of particularly young women. So these are huge issues which we're going to have to grapple with. And either you're part of the solution or you're part of the problem, right? And so in a period of change, I think the potential for workers to gain from it is to take away from the confrontation and do what Richard Freeman says, which is that, unions can raise the wage, but if you help raise the size of the pot, then employers will be happy to, if you raise your productivity and work with the firms. I think that's where we're going to go. Until this point, it's been confrontational, and employers have said, we've got to get rid of you. But I do think industrial relations is very much a function of the pendulum. I mean, I was brought up in the 70s in the universities, and in 1972, I was a student, and basically there were strikes everywhere, and the lights used to go off. And in my where I lived, the lights would go off. The only place there were candles was the local pub. So we couldn't do any work. The lights went off because the electric workers were on strike, and we had to go to the pub. When I remember that, well, it was great.
that really enhanced the productivity, didn't it?
But the good thing about it was not only did everybody have to go, so did the professors, because there was no power anywhere, right?
Yeah, right. So come back. If we could come back to what we started with, the outcome of the growth here in the economy, and more specifically, we can see that, so unions managed to get, an increase in wages in certain industries. We might see some spillover effect, and the general kind of Pavlovian reaction is, this is going to, push inflation again. And, this is where productivity becomes a real important aspect.
If you have a wage settlement where the productivity increase, essentially it pays for itself, right? That's the way I always think.
But how do you communicate that in an easy way, right?
Right. Well, I think what I quite like today, I was reading, I think this is a really big deal. I mean, I was reading, going back just before we started this, thinking about how much did they settle for? They said that the AEW agreed a 30% pay raise over this period of the contract. I mean, this is really, really big, in a period also when inflation appears to be coming down. So this looks like significant real wage rises. And obviously we're sitting in an election year. The polls suggest that in 5 swing states, Biden's behind. Well, obviously there's a huge dilemma here. I mean, are the car unions going to go to support Biden, even though they haven't? So this whole process is political. But I think what we're going to see, I like to think of this as a sort of pendulum. And the question is, has this pendulum started to shift? And workers have been felt under fire. Think about things, as I say, like the gig economy. People can't get enough hours, insecurity at work. I mean, I'm a tenured professor at Dartmouth. I'm at the end of the spectrum, but there's a lot of other people who aren't as secure and as comfortable as I am, who entered the labour market, 50 years ago. But the youngsters coming in now are struggling. But I think we're going to have a rethink and a reshift, as you say, with AI and all sorts of other things coming. And my students are aware of this. And so the question is, are unions going to respond or die? And I suspect they're going to. I mean, now they realize you got to be in this together.
Yeah, but precisely the together. I mean, that depends now on, if you say the pendulum is shifting with the pressure then on management, and the question is whether there too there was a reckoning that there is some.
Right. I mean, I agree with that. I mean, think of managers have done extremely well. The firm made profits. You kept it all to yourself. Basically happened. And the workers didn't get anything. Was that a smart long-term strategy? Probably not. And so, you could blame the workers, but let's go and see, why did you do that? Why did you just pay all the money came from the Trump tax cuts, and you paid it all to the shareholders and yourselves? well, okay. In the end, that was always gonna haunt you. And I think the balance towards this sort of big rise in inequality. I mean, unions are going to try and impact and help. They squash differentials within a firm, right?
Yeah.
So you get to a firm, and everyone gets, you get the same rate for the job. They cut out the low end. I mean, it's like the comparison between the US and Sweden or something, where the solidaristic wage policy keeps the distribution kind of flatter. It means also that car workers in Sweden and Volvo workers and Saab workers actually relatively don't get paid that much because they're closer to the middle. So it has all kinds of effects. But
talking about the middle, I mean, what is interesting now is the fact that you have workers, some who are in favor of the populist movement,
right,
that seems to be,
right,
edging towards, the Trump, the Republican
right.
Party. How is that being navigated, with unions that tend to be more on the Democrat side?
This is very interesting. One thing I think I got a new paper came out today. It came across my desk. I'm actually looking at it here. It actually says a study was just done looking at older adults using data in the United States. And basically what they found was that unionization during people's lives predicted better health amongst older adults. So being a union essentially was more likely to get you decent health insurance, more likely to get you a pension. So when you got to your older life, that people's health was better. So that's the first thing. The second thing, there's a whole set of stories, and I've worked on a lot of this. So in many senses, what happened was a group of people were those who were left behind. I mean, these people were left behind by globalization. This was sort of absence of unions. Well, who were they? And this is Case and Deaton's Deaths of Despair and work that I've done on despair. And the answer was, go back to your point, who were the Trump voters and who were these folks who were committing deaths of despair? Deaths of despair meaning overdose deaths, deaths from opioid poisoning and so on, suicide and cirrhosis of the liver.
Right.
And these people were exactly the people you've talked to. In a sense, the absence of a union meant that they struggled, they were left behind. And what you saw is who were the peak people? What was the peak age at which your deaths of despair were being committed? And it was 50-year-old, white, less educated. We thought it was men, but it was men and women. And so the consequence of this was that we had 100,000 a year. It wasn't about 30-year-olds, it was about 50-year-olds. If you look at deaths from taking overdose of cocaine or heroin or any of this stuff, it was amongst this group of workers. So this is very consistent with this work about health. Union pay was decent pay. So Gallup talks about, I've written a book called, basically about where the good jobs are. And Gallup talks about a good job as being one with enough hours and a security so that you get a decent pay packet every week. And so what happened with the unions gave you a decent pay packet every week. And some of the insecurity we saw, not only did people not get the same wage, but they didn't get a guaranteed pay packet every week. So the answer in many senses, as I say, my book's about it, is actually about the absence of good jobs. And the absence of good jobs, and Case and Deaton talk a lot about their view, is the absence of good jobs was driven by globalization, given by the fact that the winners, you and me, didn't compensate the losers. Why were we winners? Well, we were winners because the price of the goods fell. We got cheaper goods, but at the expense of removing good jobs from less skilled people who then ended up being in despair, because the work shows they're in despair, and dying. And then people are upset and they end up populist movements in the UK. Brexit is a classic example. Brexit, basically the people voted for Brexit. So a good example, Wales voted for Brexit. Wales was basically the poorest place in Europe. Per person got about $4,000 a person in subsidy from the European Union. So then they voted to get rid of the European Union, and then they said, well, aren't we going to keep the money? You go, no. So then people who voted for it were the ones who did the worst. The last people in the world, actually, when you look in the UK, the people who voted for it precisely were the people who shouldn't have voted for it. The people in Wales should have absolutely voted to keep the money, but they voted for it, and now they lost all the money. Oh, okay. So obviously part of this story, I think, is because they were left behind. The good jobs weren't there, and the good jobs were not replaced by good non-union jobs. They were replaced by weak, unstable.
Right.
I mean, in the UK, to people who are listening in America, they have things called 0 hours contracts, which unions would never let happen. A 0 hours contract is I work for you and your company, but you guarantee me no hours at all. But you tell me on the Sunday night how many hours I'm going to work this week and which day and when.
Yeah.
Great. And including none. But you're a worker for that firm. Well, think of that terrible insecurity. How do you pay the kids? I mean, in fact, they say to you, oh, it's got to be on every afternoon from 2:30 on. Well, how do you pick the kids up?
But you see, and this went hand in hand with this whole period of couple of decades of, liberalization and globalization and the lack of retooling, policies that could
absolutely retooling. I remember a great suggestion, and it seems to have been lost. I mean, I remember Biden never said to me, he would said something like, what we'll do is we should go out there and basically make and insulate houses across America, insulate 50 million houses. But how will we do this? Well, we'll hire people. We'll hire the people in the left behinds, and let's say we'll train them to insulate houses, and we'll pay them $100 an hour, right? We'll give them a good job, and off you go, right? You can go to this town, right? Suddenly you think, well, that's a pretty darn good idea, but we don't do it. Right, we haven't done that stuff.
Right.
And so I think
there will be a day of reckoning with AI that we need to do that.
I agree with that. The danger is that, I mean, the day of reckoning came in the UK. They were going to build the big train line, and
that's right.
So what was amazing, the Prime Minister went to Manchester and made a speech saying, "I'm going to cancel the train to Manchester." Like, really? Great, fantastic. So I agree with that, but I think the unions, being a Luddite in this world is not going to work. And maybe that's the lesson the unions have learned. But we should go back and say that there is a significant role for unions in the public sector. The question is, what role do they play? And I've represented lots of employers, and the issue in many places is going to be the following. There are the teachers, there are the taxpayers, and there are the students. And the question is, whose interests are the unions representing? They say, well, it's fine, we can pay the teachers more, we don't have to give the kids any more, and actually we'll just raise taxes. So that's probably not going to make people very popular, right? So within the public sector, we've seen a lot of that. And I've fought in many cases about suddenly a city is faced with one of the cases I worked on, the city's faced with a huge decline in money because there's not as many kids anymore. So what are you going to do? And the union says, raise taxes. Well, that probably isn't. I remember in a case I stood there and I said, well, I represent the taxpayers of this city and I object, right? You're going to have to take some of the losses too. It can't be the union says, we're the ones who are protected. The kids and the taxpayers are all the ones who are going to lose, not us. That's not sharing, because then you end up saying, right, how are we going to find ways to fire you lot? That's what it's going to result in, right?
Absolutely. And, we could go on and on, Danny. I mean, this is a very rich subject and complex subject. There are so many different aspects to it. So I think that, at this moment, maybe we should think in terms of saying perhaps we'll resume at another time. But before we leave, what it makes you optimistic?
Wow. Well, I think some of the things. Let me be very local. One of the things that I see right now is a big issue about the left behinds and about the well-being of, particularly of young people. Maybe a sort of narrow answer, but Dartmouth has just hired a new president who is fantastic. And she's come in and said, my number one thing is to care about the well-being of the students. What we're seeing is this really big rise in their ill-being, and I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. And she announced, the first thing she announced is Dartmouth is out in the woods. and people are scattered everywhere. And she said, we want to be a sense of community. And I'm going to build 1,000 dorm rooms on the campus so we can all be together. And now we're going to think about ways of making the mental well-being of the students our top priority. She said, I've got 5 priorities. But number 1 is about caring about the well-being of our students and our faculty. And I'm going to put money into it, and I'm going to motivate it. And she invited in her first month in office, all the living surgeons general to come to Dartmouth and start to talk about, well, how are we going to improve the well-being of the young and of everybody else? But if we start to think about that, that gives me hope. I mean, in our small place, and she said, and I've funded it. I funded this. We're going to do this. And people here have responded like, whoa, this is great. So I do think, and there are people, people are starting to think we have a problem. We need to do things. And I think that gives me hope. Just down the road. I mean, I'm just very inspired by what she's thinking about, and other people are trying to say the same kind of things. We need to understand what happened. You said it well. If we leave people behind, we've learned bad things happen. We can't do that. We can't do that anymore. So we're going to have to start including people. We can't write people off. And unions are either part of that. Your AI is a good example. Unions are either part of that. I mean, give me another example of what she did. She announced that immediately what we're going to do is we're going to give subsidies for childcare for anybody who works at Dartmouth who's got a kid. I mean, I don't have a kid. Doesn't matter. I'm for it. I'm not going to get anything. But she's announced, if you make less than 60, you get whatever. If you make 60, So Dartmouth immediately says, okay, well, the government's not doing anything about it. Dartmouth is going to help people subsidise their childcare. If we're seeing movements like that at a little place like Dartmouth, I mean, we're rich, I get it, but I think that gives me hope.
Yeah. It's very uplifting. On that.
Oh, and everybody here thinks she's the greatest thing ever, and she is. So this is CM Blaylock, our new president. So I'm impressed.
That is, no, one should be. And, at the end of the day, that should have been, sure, it should happen. But the fact is that we are all in awe means that there is a lot of work to be done.
Well, think of the potential. If the president of Dartmouth can do it, so can the president of Company A, JP Morgan and Schwab and, Facebook and all these places, Apple. Well, they can start to do it too. And if unions want to be part of that deal, I mean, the union people get it. Some of the workers at Dartmouth are unions, some of them are not. People get it. You want to be on the program, be on the program. And I think that's that's the story. You're on the program. You're going to raise productivity. You're going to try and be friendly. I think that's where the action goes.
Well, on that really positive note, I just want to thank you, Danny. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Of course. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.